everyone, so we will be looking at the social developments in the 1940s, and the two groups that we will be looking at are African Americans and women. Okay, so this is the time of the Second World War, and lots of African Americans were actually um, uh, introduced to the army. Okay, so as the USA were fighting racism and racists in Germany, people started to ask more questions about racism in America. Okay, so it's very ironic that they were fighting racism in Europe, but there was lots and lots of racism inside America. Over 1 million African Americans actually joined the US Army. Now, they weren't given very high ranking jobs or roles within the Army, but they were still a huge integral part of the Army. Okay, and without them, the US Army wouldn't have been as powerful as it was. Okay. So they did a massive, massive favour really to America and the Army, and they wanted something in return. A further 2 million African Americans were actually working in the factories during the war. So if they weren't in the army, for example, like women or young men would have been employed into the factories making weapons. And a lot of people moved from the south to the north because the north was far more industrial than the south. And they actually realised that there was a lot more racism in the south than there was in the north, okay? Which led to questions of why and how can we stop this from happening. So as a result, the NAACP membership actually rose from 50,000 to 500,000 during the period of the war, okay, which then propels the changes and protests to make changes for Black Americans during this time, okay, and we see those changes being formulated in the 1950s. So this was really a time for African Americans to really reflect and see how ironic the situation was, and then make those plans for changes in the 1950s and 60s that we see later on. Okay, the second group that we'll look at is women. So before this time, women did have the right to vote, but there was still this traditional landscape in society where lots of women, especially middle class women, would be at home, being housewives or ladies of the house or ladies of leisure, really, not necessarily working as you would see women working today. Some women did work. Okay, it's not a case like women just didn't work in general. Some women would have worked, but they would have worked because they needed money. It was out of necessity and need rather than want. Okay, so during the time of the war, of course, the men went to fight the war after 1941. And so the women took over a lot of the workforce, okay, and all these new factories that were being built to supply weapons for the European armies as well as the American army, and needed people to work in. So women filled up these jobs. So 1 in 3 aircraft workers were actually women. They were paid higher wages than before, and many of them didn't want to go back to low wages or unemployment, meaning like housewives or generally just not working like before the war. They wanted these changes because they felt this freedom, this liberation, and after the war, many more women decided to go into the workforce. Now, that doesn't mean that they were accepted fully and they were given equal opportunities and equal wages, but it did pave the way for changes later on. Now, nearly 200,000 women joined the armed forces, so it wasn't just men that joined. They would have done like auxiliary roles, but still an integral part of the army. And the percentage of married women went up in the labour force, so 35% to 50% of women started working between 1941 and 1945, and this showed that whilst men were out fighting the war, they could handle the children but also go to work, so it gave them that confidence to work post-war as well. Okay, so those are some of the social developments during the 1940s.